the Red Lion Pub, Cambridge, England. August 18, 1943. The late afternoon sun filtered through tobacco smoke as squadron leader James Saylor, Malin, set his pint down with deliberate care. Around him, RAF pilots crowded the worn wooden tables, their blue uniforms still carrying the scent of aviation fuel and altitude. The wireless had just broadcast news from the continent, and the mood in the pub shifted from jovial to grimly satisfied. 60 bombers, Malin said, his South African accent cutting through the murmur of conversation. The Americans lost 60 flying fortresses yesterday over Schweinfurt. 60. A young pilot from 19 Squadron whistled low. That's what, 600 men. Gone in one afternoon, Malin confirmed. He reached for the intelligence summary that had been circulating through Fighter Command. The Yanks flew straight into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. Their thunderbolts turned back at the Dutch border, and Jerry was waiting for exactly that moment. In the corner, a lone American P-47 pilot shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been invited to the pub by an RAF colleague, but now he wished he'd stayed on base. Malin noticed him and softened his tone slightly. No offense intended, Lieutenant. Your boys are brave. But bravery without range is just delayed catastrophe. He tapped the report. Physics is physics. Your Thunderbolt burns fuel like a house on fire. 320 miles combat radius gets you to the German border and back. Meanwhile, the best targets are 600 miles from England. The American had no answer. Because there wasn't one. Another RAF pilot chimed in. We tried to tell them. Daylight bombing without proper escort is suicide. But Arnold and his boys insisted the bombers could defend themselves with formation firepower. He shook his head. 17 flying fortresses also written off upon return. Damaged beyond repair. That's 77 heavy bombers in one mission. And for what? Someone asked. Did they even hit the target? They did, Malin admitted. Reduced ball bearing production by 40%. But at what cost? The Americans can't sustain losses like this. At this rate, there won't be an 8th Air Force by Christmas. The pub fell quiet. Through the windows, the English countryside stretched green and peaceful. But 600 miles east, the war was consuming men and machines at a rate that defied comprehension. On the morning of October 14, 1943, the briefing room at Thorpe Abbott's awakened before dawn. The room smelled of strong coffee and nervous sweat. 200 men packed the wooden benches, their faces pale in the harsh electric light. At the front of the room, an intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the wall map. A collective groan filled the space. Gentlemen, the officer said, your target today is Schweinfurt. 20-year-old Lieutenant David Palmer felt his stomach drop. Schweinfurt. The raid 2 months ago had been catastrophic, and now they were going back. The intelligence officer continued, his voice deliberately even. Ball-bearing factories. 5 main plants. 30,000 workers. This is a priority target. He paused. You'll have P-47 escort to the German border. After that, you're on your own until the return leg. Someone in the back muttered, just like last time. The briefing continued with weather reports, altitude assignments, bombing coordinates. But Palmer barely heard it. He was doing the math in his head. Schweinfurt was 400 miles into Germany. They'd be without fighter escort for over 2 hours. 2 hours of German fighters attacking at will. The chaplain gave a brief prayer. Many of the men bowed their heads. Some just stared at the map, at the red line stretching deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. By 11 that morning, Palmer's B-17, the Duchess, was droning eastward over Germany at 23,000 feet. Through the plexiglass nose, he could see the other bombers of the formation, 60 aircraft stacked in defensive boxes. Their contrails painted white streaks across the blue sky, visible for miles. Visible to everyone below. The P-47 Thunderbolts had turned back 15 minutes ago at the German border, waggling their wings in farewell before diving away toward England. Palmer had watched them go with a sinking feeling. Now they were alone. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The intercom crackled with the top turret gunner's warning. Palmer looked up. Black specks materialized against the sun, growing rapidly larger. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, perhaps 50 fighters diving toward the formation. The first pass came with devastating speed. Cannon fire tore through the bomber stream. A 17 ahead of the Duchess erupted in flames, fell away trailing smoke and burning fuel. Palmer counted 3 parachutes before the aircraft disappeared below. Then the German fighters were passed, pulling up hard to reposition for another attack. Here they come again. For the next 90 minutes, the attacks were relentless. German fighters dove through the formation, firing cannons and machine guns, launching rockets from beyond defensive range. The bomber gunners fired back desperately, filling the sky with tracers, but the attacks continued. Palmer watched bomber after bomber fall away. Some exploded in midair. Others spiraled down with engines dead or wings torn off. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the green German landscape far below. The Duchess shook as flak exploded nearby over Schweinfurt. Palmer gripped the controls, kept the aircraft steady for the bombardier. The target indicators appeared ahead. Smoke already rising from earlier bombing runs. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free. Palmer banked away from the target, following the formation toward home. The German fighters were waiting. The following evening, the Red Lion pub in Cambridge filled with the same pilots who had gathered there in August. But the atmosphere had shifted from satisfaction to something darker. Squadron Leader Malin read from the official casualty report. His voice was quiet but carried through the silent room. 60 B-17s shot down. 17 damaged beyond repair. 650 men killed, wounded, or missing. He set the paper down. 26% casualties. In one mission, an RAF pilot who had been at Schweinfurt in August spoke up. That's not sustainable. The Americans will have to suspend deep penetration rates. They already have, Malin confirmed. Officially, it's to allow for tactical reassessment. Unofficially, they don't have enough aircraft or crews left to continue. The young American P-47 pilot from August was there again. This time, no one made jokes. The losses were too staggering, too real. The problem, Malin said carefully, is that there's no fighter in existence that can escort bombers to targets deep in Germany. The physics don't work. Not with current technology. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. Because 6,000 miles away, in factories in California and Texas, a solution was already rolling off assembly lines. 3 weeks later, a silver fighter sat on the tarmac at RAF Duxford, gleaming in the weak autumn sun. Its lines were elegant, almost predatory, with a bubble canopy that offered exceptional visibility and a distinctive nose air intake below the propeller. The North American P-51 Mustang had arrived in England. Squadron Leader Malin walked around the aircraft slowly, taking in every detail. He'd read the specifications. Maximum speed 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Combat radius with drop tanks, 750 miles. 750 miles. That was enough to reach Berlin and return. What do you think? The American liaison officer asked. Malin chose his words carefully. On paper, it's impressive, but we've seen impressive specifications before. The proof will be in combat. What he didn't say was that the aircraft represented something that made many British pilots uncomfortable. It had been designed to British specifications, powered by a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, but built by Americans who had initially installed the wrong engine and created a mediocre low-altitude fighter. It had taken British test pilot Ron Harker to suggest mating the Mustang airframe with the Merlin engine after flying an early Allison-powered version. The transformation had been remarkable, but now, this hybrid aircraft, this colonial bastardization of British engineering and American production, was being presented as the solution to a problem that had killed hundreds of Allied airmen. Malin lit a cigarette and studied the Mustang again. When can we see it fly? He asked. On the 1st of December, the Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine roared to life at Duxford, and every pilot on the field turned to watch. The propeller became a blur as the American test pilot ran through his checks. Then the fighter was rolling, accelerating down the runway with startling speed. It rotated smoothly and climbed away at an angle that made the watching RAF pilots exchange glances. For the next 30 minutes, the test pilot put the aircraft through its paces. Loops, rolls, high-speed dives, tight turns. The Mustang moved through the air with a grace that even the Spitfire couldn't quite match. When it landed, Squadron Leader Malin was waiting. Well, the American liaison officer asked. Malin took a long drag on his cigarette. It's fast, faster than anything we have at altitude. The range specifications appear accurate. He paused. But speed and range mean nothing if it can't fight. Can it turn with a 109? Can it climb with a 190? There's only one way to find out, the officer replied. 2 weeks later, the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England equipped with P-51 They were assigned to the 9th Air Force initially, but everyone knew their real mission: escort the 8th Air Force bombers deep into Germany. The group's commander was Colonel Kenneth Martin, but among his pilots was a man who would become legendary: Lieutenant Colonel Donald Blakesley. Blakesley was an interesting case. He'd served with the RAF's Eagle squadrons before America entered the war, flying Spitfires over England and France. He'd transferred to the USAF and commanded the 4th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts. His lack of love for the heavy Thunderbolt was well known. When he first flew the Mustang, his reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "This," he told his pilots, "is the aircraft we've been waiting for." 12 days later, the 354th Fighter Group's first long-range escort mission tested both aircraft and doctrine over German skies. 60 P-51 climbed to altitude and rendezvoused with a formation of B-17s heading for Kiel, 490 miles into enemy territory. For the bomber crews, accustomed to watching their P-47 escorts turn back at the German border, the sight of fighters still with them over the target was almost surreal. When German fighters appeared, the Mustangs engaged with devastating effectiveness. The Packard Merlin engine maintained full power at altitudes where German fighters struggled. The P-51's speed and maneuverability allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement. 3 Luftwaffe fighters were shot down. The bombers completed their mission without loss to enemy fighters. It was only one mission, but it proved the concept. By January, Squadron Leader Malin was back at the Red Lion, studying mission reports that had been circulating through Fighter Command. The Americans were flying deeper into Germany than ever before, and their bomber losses were dropping. The difference was the Mustang. Bomber losses have fallen by 60% since the P-51 arrived, an intelligence officer explained. In October, they were losing 9% of sorties. Now it's 3.5%. Malin lit a cigarette, his expression thoughtful. The aircraft performs as advertised, then better. The Luftwaffe is struggling to counter it. The Mustang can fight at altitudes where German fighters lose effectiveness. And the range, the officer shook his head. They're escorting bombers to targets we couldn't reach with Spitfires, even if we stripped them of everything but fuel tanks. A young RAF pilot who'd been listening spoke up. "So the Americans finally got something right?" Malin gave him a sharp look. "They got several things right. They listened to our test pilot about the engine. They had the industrial capacity to build the aircraft in quantity. And they had the humility to admit their initial escort fighters weren't adequate." He paused. "That last one might be the most important." The pub was quiet for a moment. "There's a rumor," the intelligence officer said carefully, "that they're planning something ambitious." "Very ambitious." "How ambitious?" "Berlin." On February 20th, 1944, Operation Argument began from Debden Airfield with a simple objective: destroy the German aircraft industry before the invasion of Europe. For 5 days, the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command launched coordinated attacks against aircraft factories across Germany. Over 3,000 bomber sorties, escorted by fighters that now included large numbers of P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich with everything it had. The air battles that followed were the most intense of the war to that point. Hundreds of fighters clashed at altitudes above 20,000 feet, contrails weaving complex patterns across the winter sky. Lieutenant Colonel Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group, now re-equipped with Mustangs, on a mission to Leipzig. His combat report was clinical but telling. Engaged approximately 40 enemy fighters over target area. P-51 performance superior at altitude. Enemy aircraft unable to disengage when pursued. Claimed 7 destroyed, 3 probables. Across the 5 days of Big Week, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of Germany's experienced fighter pilots. Not 17% of their aircraft, 17% of the pilots themselves. Irreplaceable men with thousands of hours of combat experience. The Luftwaffe fought desperately, but the mathematics of attrition were inexorable. For every American fighter lost, The Germans lost 3. And America was building fighters faster than they could be shot down. By the end of Big Week, the 8th Air Force had lost 137 bombers and 33 fighters. Heavy losses by any measure. But the Luftwaffe had lost over 250 fighters and pilots. Losses they couldn't replace. The balance of air power over Europe had shifted decisively. The evening of March 3rd found Squadron Leader Malin at the Red Lion, reading an operations order with growing disbelief. "They're going to Berlin," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, 660 heavy bombers, escorted all the way to the target and back." The pub fell silent. Berlin, the capital of the Reich. The city Hermann Göring had sworn would never see enemy aircraft in daylight. "It's over 600 miles, someone said. Can the Mustang really do it?" According to this, Malin tapped the paper. "They'll use 108-gallon drop tanks. Combat radius extends to 850 miles. Berlin is within range." An older pilot who'd flown in the Battle of Britain spoke up. "If they pull this off, if they put fighters over Berlin, the psychological impact will be devastating. The Germans have been telling their people that the Reich is invulnerable to daylight attack." "They've been lying," Malin said. "But tomorrow, 66 million Germans will discover the truth." He set down his pint, suddenly not thirsty anymore. Across the channel, in dozens of airfields across East Anglia, bomber crews and fighter pilots were preparing for the mission that would change the war. The next day, at 25,000 feet above Berlin, the bomber stream stretched across the sky like a steel river. 660 B-17s and B-24s flew in tight formation. Around them, weaving protective patterns through the thin air, flew scores of silver fighters bearing American markings. P-51 Mustangs. Over Berlin. Through the canopy of his Mustang, Lieutenant Colonel Blakesley could see the sprawling outline of Berlin below. The city was clearly visible through scattered clouds, and he could identify major landmarks. The Reichstag, the Brandenburg Gate, the heart of Nazi Germany, and surrounding the bombers, protecting them from the German fighters scrambling desperately to intercept, were his Mustangs. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. The radio crackled. Messerschmitt 109's dove toward the formation. Blakesley rolled his Mustang and climbed to meet them. The Packard Merlin engine pulled smoothly, maintaining power at an altitude where the German fighters were gasping for air. The engagement was brief and decisive. The P-51's speed and altitude performance gave it an overwhelming advantage. The German fighter broke off, diving away toward lower altitude where its engine could breathe. Blakesley didn't pursue. His mission wasn't to chase German fighters. It was to protect the bombers. He returned to his station above the bomber formation and watched as they completed their bombing run. Below, in Berlin, air raid sirens wailed across the city. In his command bunker, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring watched the contrails above the capital and understood what they meant. Later, in an interrogation after the war, he would recall this moment precisely. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The bombers completed their mission and turned for home. Every single Mustang that had escorted them to Berlin remained with them, shepherding them back across 600 miles of hostile territory. Of the 660 bombers that attacked Berlin that day, 13 were lost. Most to flak, few to fighters. The Mustang had changed everything. 24 hours later, Squadron Leader Malin walked into the Red Lion and found it unusually quiet. The usual banter was absent. Instead, pilots clustered around tables, reading newspapers and mission reports. He ordered his pint and sat down with a group from 19 Squadron. "Well," one of them said finally, "the Americans did it." Malin nodded slowly. "They put fighters over Berlin and brought the bombers home." Someone slid a copy of the operational report across the table. Malin read it carefully. 660 bombers. 13 lost, less than 2%. Most of those to flak, not fighters. The psychological impact in Germany must be enormous, the 19 Squadron pilot continued. Göring told them Berlin would never see daylight bombers. Now they've seen both bombers and escorts. Malin set down the report. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "when we laughed at American losses over Schweinfurt? When we said their doctrine was flawed and their escorts inadequate?" Heads nodded around the table. "We were right," Malin continued. "But we were also wrong. We assumed the problem was unsolvable. The Americans assumed it was an engineering challenge." He gestured at the report. "They solved it. with a British engine and American production capacity. The pub was silent for a moment. There's a lesson in that, someone said. Several lessons, Malin agreed. No one made jokes about American inadequacy that night. The laughter had died somewhere over Berlin. 6 weeks later, on April 18th, the crash site at Debden Airfield was cordoned off when squadron leader Malin arrived. He'd been invited by the American liaison officer who'd shown him the Mustang back in November. The wreckage was scattered across a field in Wiltshire. What remained of the P-51 was barely recognizable. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the liaison officer, said quietly. Test pilot. But more than that, he was the man who pushed hardest for the Mustang program. When everyone else was focused on the P-38 and P-47, Hitchcock insisted the Mustang was the answer. Malin recognized the name. Hitchcock had been a polo player before the war, one of America's elite. He'd also been a fighter pilot in the First World War, the youngest American to win a commission. What happened? Test flight. Diving tests with external fuel tanks. Something went wrong during the pullout. The liaison officer's voice was tight. He didn't make it. They stood in silence, looking at the wreckage. The man who had championed the aircraft that was now winning the air war over Europe had died testing improvements to it. He won't see D-Day, Malin said. No, but without him, D-Day might not be possible. At dawn on June 6, 1944, landing craft approached the Normandy beaches through heavy seas. On board, soldiers gripped their rifles and tried not to be sick. Above them, the sky was filled with aircraft. But every fighter they could see bore American markings. Over 500 P-51 Mustangs provided air cover for the invasion. They flew in overlapping waves, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters that attempted to reach the landing zones were intercepted and destroyed before they could attack. By midday, only 2 German aircraft had reached the beaches. Both were shot down within minutes. In his headquarters, Luftwaffe Field Marshal Hugo Sperl studied the reports with growing despair. The Luftwaffe had been bled white over Germany in the preceding months. Now, when the decisive moment had come, it could offer no meaningful resistance. The Allies had achieved total air superiority, and the Mustang was the primary reason why. The following evening at the Red Lion, the invasion was the only topic of conversation. Pilots crowded around wireless sets, listening to BBC reports from Normandy. The news was cautiously optimistic. The landings had succeeded. The Allies were ashore. Squadron leader Malin sat with a group that included both RAF and USAF pilots now. The Americans were regular visitors to the pub, and the earlier tensions had faded. Your boys did well yesterday, Malin told an American P-51 pilot. We counted over 500 Mustangs over the beaches. The Germans didn't stand a chance. The American nodded. It's what we trained for. What the aircraft was built for. Do you know, Malin said, I was one of the skeptics back in November when the first Mustangs arrived. I thought it was too good to be true. British engine, American airframe, colonial engineering. And now, Malin considered his words carefully. Now I think it's the perfect example of what we can achieve together. You had the industrial capacity and the determination. We had the engine technology and the operational experience. Combined, we created something neither of us could have built alone. He raised his pint. To cooperation. The American raised his as well. To winning. Around them, British and American pilots drank together, watching the sun set over an England that was, for the first time in 5 years, truly safe from invasion. The numbers told the story of transformation. In October 1943, before the Mustang arrived in force, the 8th Air Force lost 9.1% of bomber sorties. By February 1944, that figure had dropped to 3.5%. Over the course of the war, P-51 Mustangs destroyed over 3,000 Luftwaffe aircraft in aerial combat and another 3,000 on the ground. They escorted bombers on missions totaling over 15,000 sorties. But beyond the statistics lay something more important. The proof that cooperation could overcome doctrine, that innovation could defeat ideology. The British had designed an aircraft. Then they'd suggested an engine. The Americans had built it in quantities that would have been impossible for Britain alone. Together, they'd created the weapon that won air superiority over Europe. In 1985, at a reunion of Allied fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, a former Luftwaffe general was asked about the Mustang. His answer was simple. When we saw them over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. You can fight against bombers. You can fight against doctrine. But you cannot fight against an enemy who solves problems faster than you can create them. The P-51 Mustang had been that solution. Born from British innovation and American production, tested in the crucible of combat, it had transformed mockery into respect and skepticism into victory. In the end, the laughter died not with a bang, but with the thunder of Merlin engines over Berlin. And in that thunder was the sound of history turning. The skies belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang had given them the key.